Hi everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a hometown scrapbook. Swan's story. Hello there. We told you last night about James G. Swan, the early pioneer who came to Washington's coast among the very first white settlers and who contributed what is probably our most accurate and complete knowledge of this part of the country with his book, 3 Years' Residence in the Washington Territory, published in 1857. Tonight we're going to pursue that book and bring you some of the comments of this pioneer who lived for 3 years on Willapa Harbor before there was such a thing as the cities of Hoquiam or Aberdeen, before Grays Harbor had half a dozen citizens, and when the Pacific Northwest was an almost unknown wilderness to the rest of the nation. So when Dick Crombie has had a few words from our sponsor, we'll open the scrapbook to find some pages of early Northwest history and tell us the eyewitness accuracies of our part of the world and what it was like nearly 100 years ago. Dick, a few words from our sponsor, please. We told you last night when describing the journey of James Swan to Willapa Harbor that the man who was someday to leave behind the only complete written chronicle of our part of the nation, that Swan came at the request of Charles Russell of Willapa Harbor to pay a visit. He arrived in one of the earliest ships to enter the bay and found Russell's house the only frame building on the bay. Russell was engaged in collecting and shipping of native oysters to San Francisco, and for this work he employed many Native Americans. Near his house was a large Native American lodge owned by Chief Toke, who with his family and slaves had taken up residence there, although the chief's real home was across the bay at a point then called Toke's Point, and today called Tokeland. Chief Toke was a quiet man in his day, but when Swan arrived, old age and alcohol had reduced him to the status of a harbor character and the butt of many rude jokes and the contempt of other Native Americans. Moreover, when he was sober, the chief was still a potent character, and his wife a remarkable woman. It was from Sue's, the wife, that Swan gained much of his knowledge of traditions and histories of Willapa and Grays Harbor and their Native American residents. Most of the other Native Americans were from the Chehalis, Quinaulter, Chinook tribes. They camped about the chief's house in little tents made of reed mats. Swan had been on the harbor only a few days when Russell suggested a fishing trip. Among other things that the brig Oriental had brought up from San Francisco when Swan came north was a cargo of salt for packing the salmon. And while the season was well advanced and the fish had stopped running, a party including Russell, Swan, and a number of Native Americans set out. It was the last for several days, and they stopped frequently to visit the camps of other important Native Americans on the beaches. One camp, Chief Tom Hayes, prepared a meal, grinding his own coffee in his hand-operated coffee mill. The availability of coffee in the grinder in the wilderness amazed Swan until he was informed that the coffee was available from the trading post at Astoria, and the mill had no doubt been stolen by the chief from some of the other settlers. As to fish, they found the river alive with them, and the Native Americans brought out several hundred, selecting only the fattest and rejecting those that had spawned or were growing lean. And yet, the Native Americans complained that the fish were not in the river as they used to be. However, the fishing expedition was halted when a Native American heard the call of a plover, which they described as the voice of a dead person, and the morning after they insisted on moving on, although Russell promised them almost any reward if they would just stay. if they would continue with their catch. The expedition had fished the Plaquemines River, which is today called the Plaquemines. It was shortly after the fishing trip that the brig returned to San Francisco with a partial cargo of salted salmon, and Russell went to Astoria on business. Swan was left alone with the Indians, but not for long. For only a few days later, the little schooner Willamette was wrecked at the entrance of Gray's Harbor, and her crew, rescuing themselves, hiked south over the beaches to Willapa Harbor in search of food and shelter. The crew was divided amongst the shelters of the harbor. Captain Vale, who was also the owner of a ship, her mate and crew went down to the beaches to various locations, but Swan managed to keep the ship's cook named Joe as his guest. Joe was a Dane. He had lived for some years in Sumatra, where he learnt to be an excellent cook and used curry in the East Indian manner in everything except bread and coffee. He saved his bottle of curry even though he lost most of his personal possessions, and while he stayed with Swan, kept the table filled with fine foods from the Indies. Curried ducks and geese, curried venison, curried bear meat, curried oysters, and curried fish. Sam noted in his book that Joe was a capital fellow, filled with both curies and stories, and they managed to pass off the short days and the long nights very pleasantly. Swan spent much of the time noting the comparison between the western and eastern climates in corresponding latitudes, and in his book he filled in the notes that speak of this amazement to find the winters so mild. And he also spent much time sketching and classifying the various plants, berries, fruits, and trees. He also learned to speak the Chinook tongue, and he wrote the words in English syllables, repeating his spelled-out words to other Indians, and thus checking the sound of the Chinook jargon. Many of the Chinook tribesmen were from Gray's Harbor, and he learnt much about the harbor to the north that he was soon to visit. One of the first friends that Swan made was a Native American young brave named Quim, whose knowledge of the native legends and traditions he poured out to the settler around a campfire at night. He was bright and a vigorous young Chinook, according to Swan, and was invaluable in the life of a party when the tribesmen gathered around the fires. So it was a personal matter to Swan when a smallpox epidemic swept through the coast up from Astoria, taking many lives among the Native Americans and striking down Russell's, Swan's host, who was seriously ill for days before and threw off the disease. However, Quim did not survive his ordeal, and when death became apparent, his brother Hayalma brought the ailing Indian's possession to his bedside to be buried with him. Quim predicted his end, and promptly, on the day he had set, his eyes closed for the last time. It was night when the young man passed away, and Swan had no desire to keep the body in the small house for the night, so he sewed the Indian into a canvas bag with all the valued possessions, and in the thick darkness of a winter's night, helped to carry him to his grave at the edge of Willapa Harbor. Though the epidemic, Swan acted as doctor for small community and tended to and aided the ailing Native Americans and a few whites on the harbor. On several occasions, however, what was claimed by an Indian chief to be a bad attack of smallpox was really acute alcoholism, which Swan treated with a double dose of salts and a mixture of sulfur and molasses. Soon after the epidemic had passed over the region, spring came to Willapa Harbor. It was the spring of 1853, and with the first movements of the geese heading north, Indians from all over the Pacific Northwest began to converge on the place they called Shoalwater Bay. They came to gather oysters for the settlers and dig clams and gather crabs for their own use. The New Englander was permitted to try the West Coast native oysters and compare them to those he had known as a youth. He compared them with the English Channel oyster and seems to have been quite devoted to the shellfish, for he speaks many times of eating them, as though they were a favorite dish. They could be had, he noted, for the picking, and low-tide Native Americans followed the water line out and carried in great baskets of these delicacies. Harvesting of oysters was timed to the arrival of the San Francisco and schooners. When harvested, the Native Americans placed their hauls in patches of tidewaters marked with sticks carved with their own design. Here they stored the oysters until the schooners were in, and then sold them by the bushel to be carried south to the Golden Gate, where they were in demand to feed the hungry gold miners in the California gold rush days. The schooners would spend the first 2 or 3 days on arrival selling their stock of provisions, and it was a race to be the first to the ship, because the dwellers on Willapa Harbor in 1853 had no other way of reprovisioning themselves but by the use of the sailing ships that came every few months. And once the stock of trading gear and supplies had been exhausted, the schooner stood by to load, and this again provided a race, for the schooner could handle only 1,200 to 2,000 baskets of oysters. However, they seldom carried so many, as the bottom layer often died in a crush. Swan relates that he had seen the schooner loaded to capacity in 4 hours by the Native Americans. As they rushed to get the oysters aboard, they received their pay. The oysters brought $1 a basket alongside the ship. The sum was paid in gold on the spot, and the oyster growers were prospering. However, it was not all easy money. Skates and drumfish killed many of the shellfish, and the heavy frost one winter killed all of the oysters that had been gathered and set out in shoal water. However, it was the beginning of Willapa Harbor's oyster business. Swan described the early oystermen as the most hospitable in the world, due probably to their isolated positions. They vied with each other to show him acts of kindness. It was this atmosphere of friendliness that James Swan decided to stay in Willapa Harbor, at least until he heard of a better place to go. And he stayed. That he started out to last a month or 2 was to continue here for more than 3 years. Now, Dick, let's have a few more words from our sponsor. The founding of an infant colony in the Great Pacific Northwest was, as Swan put it, no holiday work. Neither was it child's play. Whether the immigrant came by water or land, he had nothing but hard work to make his chosen land habitable. The removal of trees to make the clearing for planting was a superhuman chore for one man. The great trees must be felled, and even when down, were disposed of only with the greatest of difficulty. Swan wrote most prophetically of the part that to be played by the Northwest in the years to come, and lived to see many of his optimistic predictions come true. But the hands of the clock are closing on our scrapbook for today. Tomorrow night we'll read again from the story that James Swan wrote of Willapa Harbor and of Grays Harbor in the year of 1857, describing his 3-year residence on our coast amongst the first settlers to call this region home and to be included as part of our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.